What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you my RPG Gamer's Guide to the Holidays for 2023, as I did something similar last year that did quite well, which was actually at a viewer's suggestion, and I figured I'd try it again this year and see how it went. 2023 was a huge year for video games, tons of releases, both big and small, across tons of different genres, subgenres, etc. In all seriousness, likely to be one of the bigger years remembered about gaming. So over the course of this video, I'm going to take you through the many RPGs I've looked at this year, including a few that I did not personally play, but were nonetheless big hits, talking about the platforms they're available on, and what their standard price is. Though right there, I do want to mention that ultimately, I'm just one guy on the internet, and given that my audience is fairly global, means that trying to provide details on exact sales, etc., is a pretty futile effort on my part. So while I will be talking in US dollars, obviously that's going to be very different for people in different regions, but I'll also be talking about whether those games are worth it at full price or on a sale, etc. So my hope with this video is that you come away with it having given you at least a few different ideas for games to buy or check out, etc. Right in time for Black Friday and Cyber Monday here in about a week. And last but not least, somewhat implied, but I am mostly sticking to games that released this year with one or two exceptions. But with no further ado, let's dive into it. We're going to kick it off with tactical RPGs, games that often see you in turn-based mode, but not always, tackling a variety of challenges both in strategic and tactical combat methods that are often accompanied by other systems that come down to managing both your team or some other metric on a world map or strategy map outside of the individual combats. This particular genre got a lot of very interesting releases this year, but first up I want to talk about Aliens Dark Descent, a game set in the Aliens franchise obviously. Though somewhat unique in the genre, though there are a handful of them, this game is real-time with pause, rather than a turn-based game, and we're going to be managing a group of Marines as they try to combat an infestation of the aliens alongside a mysterious cult. Overall, this is a really cool game. It does the Aliens franchise a ton of justice in a genre that I wasn't really expecting to manage to convey a lot of that tension and fear, but they do a great job with it. And if you know anybody that likes the Aliens franchise, this is an obvious win, but moreover, this is just a fantastic TRPG. And given that the asking price, full price, is only $40, this is great either full price or on sale. That said, the only place you're not going to be able to pick this up is pretty much on the Switch, as it is available on most other platforms. Next up, we have Jagged Alliance 3, a long-awaited sequel to a cult classic, Jagged Alliance 2. The third entry in the series sees you controlling a band of mercenaries in a manner that is very much so inspired by 80s action movies. So it's all very over the top, a lot of big personalities as you try to combat multiple threats to a fictional country, and how things end for that country is largely dependent on your actions and the things you uncover. As such, this is one of those games that kind of blurs the line between tactical RPG and just a more traditional CRPG, as there's lots of choices and consequence, but on top of that, you'll be controlling your mercenaries in some pretty action-packed combat, and overall it is quite fun. This game is also available on pretty much every platform besides the Switch, and full price it is $45, which is well worth the game you're getting, but if you can find it on sale, even better. Third up, however, we have the Lamplighters League. A little bit of a heartbreaker on this one. This is from developer Harebrained Schemes, who is known for their tactical RPGs, but unfortunately the Lamplighters failed to deliver overall. And while the premise is cool enough, as we are in an alternative history occult 1930s, battling against forces that try to take over the world, it unfortunately drops the ball here and there with some combat that kind of overstays its welcome, to be honest, and some technical issues that hamper it. And while it does have some good things to offer for its asking price of $50, it's a pretty tough sell. Unless you can find this one on sale and the general premise interests you, I would stay away from it, at least at that full price. Platform-wise, this was available on PC and Xbox, and unfortunately, with the way this game panned out and problems with their publisher, Harebrained Schemes, as a company is in some unfortunate circumstances due to this one. Next up, however, we have the Miasma Chronicles, a TRPG from developer The Bearded Ladies, who are known for their other titles such as Mutant Year Zero, and Miasma Chronicles plays very similarly to that one, in that oftentimes deconstructing combat can be more of a puzzle than a tactical challenge, though this particular game does introduce a few mechanics that lean a little more heavily on the tactical side, and that can take some getting used to for some people. But if you are willing to put up with that, I think there's a great game to be had there, alongside a pretty interesting story that sees the miasma, a substance that caused the apocalypse more or less and brought humanity largely to its knees, being manipulated by a young man with a special glove, and overall it gets pretty interesting. This one is available on current generation consoles and PC, and full price it's about $50. For the most part, I think you're getting a pretty good game for that price, provided the initial premise doesn't put you off. Next up, we have Showgunners, however, a very fun little TRPG that released earlier this year, though this one is fairly small in compared to the other ones. But the premise is that we live in a dystopian future where there is a game show put on where contestants battle it out to the death to win prizes, so it is naturally very heavily inspired by The Running Man, but it is a sort of big competition, and they really lean into that with some of the progression being around finding sponsors and things like that, and the actual combat is pretty solid as well. So while it won't eat up a ton of your time, the game is just a ton of fun. And given its very tame asking price of $30, it's an easy game to pick up. Though that said, this one is only available on PC. Last for our TRPGs, we then have Wartales, available on PC and current generation Xboxes for $35. You get a whole lot of game for this one. You're going to be managing a mercenary company moving across various counties that make up the landscape, and each of those individual counties has a storyline for you to track down and manage, alongside tons of other systems that allow for emergent gameplay. And while there isn't a quite so established main story for the game, there's so much emergent gameplay and what you get out of controlling your mercenary companies and what you make of it, that it is a really great system overall. There's a fair few fun things you can do with combat, but eventually it can get a little samey, though you can do things like recruit animals and some relatively low fantasy creatures like ghost animals, etc., to spice things up a little bit. And if you're looking to write your own gritty story in a land beset by bandits and hard times, then this just might be the game for you. It was very well received, I enjoyed it myself quite a bit, and for $35 it's hard to say no to. In fact, if I were to pick best TRPG this year, I would say it's a toss-up between this one and Dark Descent. However, moving right along into a different genre, we have this year's Soulslikes, a genre that has pretty well hit its stride, and this year we got quite a few noteworthy ones. Although the genre is somewhat notorious for its difficulty, and while if you play them enough you can certainly get to a good place for them, if you are a newcomer and picking these games up for the first time, do be advised that it can take a little while to get your bearings, so to speak. But if you can push past that, you'll likely have a ton of fun. Now, to kick this section off, we first have Lies of P. I would say probably one of the better received games this year, period, but also a great Souls-like. This puts us in the role of a sort of dark reimagining of Pinocchio. And yes, before anybody says it, I am fully aware that the actual fairy tale or fable it is based on is not sunshine and roses, but that is the common depiction these days. But in Lies of P, the island of Krat is beset by several problems, a plague and a uprising of the puppets they used here to do all sorts of work, of which you are one, but as essentially Pinocchio, you are a special puppet. And in typical Souls-like fashion, we're going to be moving through, gearing up and upgrading our weapons and equipment as we take on ever more menacing monsters and some truly tough boss fights. Overall, though, a really great experience. You can pick it up full price for $60, and it's definitely worth that. And it's available on basically every platform besides Nintendo Switch, which then brings us to this year's other big Souls-like, Lords of the Fallen, a reboot of sorts to a series by the same name. This one was a bit more polarizing, however, as it had a few issues out of the gate that they've been patching incredibly quickly, to be fair, but in particular, the multiplayer aspect of this game could pose a few issues. However, the game itself is intended to be a next-generation Souls-like as we explore the city of Mornstead and its surrounding areas and try to overthrow the demon god Adir. It also features mechanics like traversing between two parallel worlds, which is a mechanic that, while not new, hasn't really been seen in a while, I would say. And in my own review for this one, I mentioned that I enjoyed the game, but I would give it a couple months before I bought it for myself. So, if you can find it on sale just ahead of the holidays, that would be fantastic for you, but once some of the issues get ironed out, I do think it's worth full price. This one is available on current generation consoles, PC, though not the Switch. Full price, it is $60, though moving right along to another Souls-like, now we have Wo Long. This one is set in the Three Kingdoms period of China, though obviously with a dark fantasy twist that sees us battling all sorts of fantastical creatures, evil enemies, etc. While this game is certainly fast-paced and offers some really fun and interesting combat mechanics in places, it unfortunately does kind of drop the ball just about everywhere else, which is why its reception was generally very mixed. And I felt much the same way. While the combat can be a lot of fun, the other surrounding systems just don't support it, as well as Team Ninja, the developer's previous work, which makes the $60 asking price a bit of a tough sell. So personally, I would grab this one on sale. It is available basically everywhere but the Nintendo Switch, so at least you have a few options. Last for our Soulslikes is a bit of an odd one with Stray Blade, a game with more vibrant and chunky graphics that is a bit more action-adventure than Souls-like technically, but Souls-like is its tag on all the stores, so here we are. This one launched with a fair few technical problems alongside combat that wasn't that fun. They actually wound up having to rework most of the combat system in patches, and while it's in a better place these days, it just didn't quite stick the landing on launch. So while it can certainly be fun here and there, it's just not as high quality as the rest of the games in the Souls-like section here, which means this one is a pretty firm buy on sale, though its normal asking price is only $35 anyway, so maybe that's not quite so offensive to you. This one is available on current generation consoles and PC, so not Switch. Though that finally brings us to our action games section. The action genre, which is kind of closely tied to action adventures as well, and I admit I'm actually getting a little loose with this one just to kind of bring all the fast-paced action games together in one place, despite where I would normally delineate between a few of them. Action games have had a good year, there was a lot going on, and outside of some technical problems here and there, most of them were quite well received. Though starting with perhaps the best one, we have Armored Core 6. You don't need to have played the previous ones to get a grip for this one, but this game sees us controlling a large customizable mech across all sorts of combat missions that see us taking down enemies in a variety of ways based on how we built our mech. And while it can be a little challenging in places until you get to grips with the controls and the options available to you, if you're willing to push past that little bit of initial frustration, there's a fantastic action game in here with some really fantastic moment-to-moment gameplay, which makes the asking price of $60 very reasonable, and you can play this one pretty much everywhere but Nintendo Switch, which is going to be a running theme for sure. Next up, however, we have Atlas Fallen. Atlas Fallen is a bit of an interesting game. I would say it's decent, but it also released in the middle of a really fantastic year with tons of options. So whereas Atlas Fallen is a decent game, but just doesn't break any new ground or really do anything special or unique, means that spending time with this one specifically is made a difficult proposition by its asking price of $50. For most people, I would say wait until this is on sale and you'd likely have some fun with it. I personally enjoyed it a fair bit, and in a normal year, I don't think it would have done bad, but in this year filled with great games, this one just being average with a $50 asking price is just a lot to get people to buy, frankly. But if you catch it on sale or something for Black Friday, I think it could definitely be worth looking into. It's available on every platform but Switch, yet again. And then we have Atomic Heart. Atomic Heart is an interesting one. It has a lot of similarities to a game like, say, BioShock, that sees us exploring a dystopian future where robots have run amok and are out here trying to kill basically everything in an alternative history Soviet Union. Unfortunately, what's still holding this one back is a fair bit of technical issues. Many people experience bugs when playing this one, and while I think the game is fun overall, you might want to do some research into the exact specifics on your hardware and what you might need to run it well, especially if you're on PC. Though this is available on basically everything besides Switch, it does have an asking price of $60, and you don't want to pay that only to find out you're having trouble running the thing, but otherwise it was pretty fun. Though next up we have one of the bigger launches of this year period with Diablo 4. Of course, the fourth entry in the very well-known Diablo franchise, one that is very near and dear to me. Diablo 4 is a bit of an interesting case, because on one hand, for its asking price of $70, I do think you are getting a ton of content, and as long as you enjoy ARPGs in general that see us just absolutely smashing hordes of demons left and right, while uncovering a dark gothic story about what has been going on in Sanctuary since the prior game, then you're in for a pretty good time. The real issue is more just the ongoing support for it, as this game is effectively a live service, unlike its previous games where they are selling battle passes for the seasons and the like. So how much long-term enjoyment you get out of it, or if that's what you go into it expecting, your mileage might vary. and as it is available everywhere but the Switch, you've got plenty of ways to check it out. Next up though is the curious case of Jedi Survivor, the follow-up to Jedi Fallen Order that sees us taking on the role of Cal Kestis as he fights back against the Empire in the wake of Order 66, which killed off most of the Jedi. Survivor here sees us going on an action-adventure, which depending on the difficulty setting you've got enabled can be either very challenging, almost Souls-like combat, or a more relaxed, fun romp through the Star Wars universe. And overall, the game is great. The real issue, however, is technical problems that have not been fully resolved. On PC, the game was almost unplayable at launch, though it's my understanding consoles had a much easier time with it. These days, a lot of the more major issues have been cleaned up. It does nonetheless still have some issues that will pop up every once in a while, so it's another game where you probably, if you are on PC, want to check out your hardware specs before you buy it, as it is a $70 game. Though, as I mentioned, it is available on consoles, as again, it is available pretty much everywhere but the Switch. Then, last for our action games, we have Remnant 2, the follow-up to Remnant from the Ashes, a universe-hopping post-apocalyptic game where we fight off the corruption of the Root as we seek to save Earth and its future well-being against further problems. Remnant, both the first game and this one, are often referred to as Dark Souls with guns, and while I don't think that's entirely accurate, it is a lot of fun. And for its fairly reasonable asking price of $50, even at full price, this is a pretty good one to pick up. This one, however, is available on current generation consoles and PC. However, that does bring us to a new genre of games, and again, got a little loose with the terminology here, but these are generally bigger open world games, and there's a pretty big variance in, I would say, both the quality and content here. Now, first up, we have this year's probably biggest success story in this regard, which is Cyberpunk Phantom Liberty. Now, the actual base game released years ago, which I'm sure many people are aware, was not received well due to its rather crippling technical problems and lackluster systems. Over the year, though, they've been cleaning it up, which finally culminated with the release of their DLC, Phantom Liberty, which overhauled tons of systems and really revamped that struggling game. And now it is quite good. So while the base game is $60, it is regularly on sale. The DLC, for an extra $30, is a ton of fun and a great way to play the game if you've been holding off on trying it out, and it is well worth the money now. However, in making a lot of those changes and updates, the prior gen consoles and everything did get left behind, so you need a current gen console or a PC to take full advantage of it, provided you've got the hardware to do so. Next up, though, we have Forspoken, one of this year's biggest flops, to be honest. And while it wasn't completely without merit, this one saw a modern-day woman from New York transported to the fantastical realm of Athia, which is struggling with a magical plague killing everyone, and unfortunately the game outside of its combat and parkour just doesn't have a lot to offer. Jumping around, moving very quickly, using the magical attacks and combos can be fun, but the world itself just doesn't really have a lot to offer and tends to fall on its face in quite a few places. And for a game that is asking $70 that also had technical problems is a bit of a tough sell for just about anyone. So unless you find this one on a deep sale, it's just not one that I would recommend, though it is available on PlayStation 5 and PC. But then we have Hogwarts Legacy, an open-world RPG set in, of course, the Harry Potter universe that lets you take on the role of a fifth-year student of your own making, though it takes place well before the books do. And while as a Harry Potter game it can be quite fun, as you can explore a lot of what that world has to offer, unfortunately the open world aspects of it can be a bit formulaic and lack a lot of, say, depth or consequence. So while it is overall a pretty good game, I do think it got outshone by quite a few other titles this year, but that doesn't really change the fact that this game still did very well and was fun. So for its base asking price of $60, available on pretty much every platform, even Nintendo Switch now, you'll likely have a pretty good time. But seeing as this one released all the way back at the beginning of the year, it has been on sale a couple of times since then, so maybe worth checking out on, say, Black Friday or Cyber Monday for a potential deal on it. But then we have Redfall, another one of this year's, I would say, heartbreakers, really. This one has recovered a little bit since its initial launch, as some patches have brought it up to speed, but Redfall is a game in which we take on a role of several heroes who fight back against a vampire menace who have assailed the island town of Redfall. Unfortunately, the game was a bit of a mess on launch, and these days with patches it has only ever just been made okay, and for a $70 asking price, there just quite simply isn't enough there to really recommend. So unless you see this game on a deep sale, I wouldn't bother picking it up, though it is available on PC and Xbox. Also available on PC and Xbox for $70, we have Starfield, a polarizing title, I would say, a brand new space exploration-based IP from Bethesda that people seem to be pretty split down the middle about. While I personally enjoyed it quite a bit, even in my own review I note things such as there isn't really much of a compelling reason to explore the game's almost 1,000 planets. But this game, more than just about any other game, I would say if you haven't made up your mind about it already, and you're curious about whether to buy this for someone else potentially, I would watch a lot of videos, make sure you kind of just understand what it is you're buying, as again, people are pretty split on this one. Now, next up, we have our one, I would say, big immersive sim that came out this year, which is actually a remake of a 1994 game, which is System Shock. System Shock was a bit of a cult classic, so if you have someone you know who's into games from that time period or RPGs, you might want to mention System Shock, as this particular game is a really well-beloved classic title. And largely, the remake pretty much nailed bringing it back to life, as it is such a faithful adaptation that guides for the original 1994 version actually worked with this new game, and overall it was a ton of fun. A little dated in some systems here and there, kind of just by design, which I think is made up for by the fact that they're only asking for $40 for this particular title, and it is available everywhere but the Switch. But then we have CRPGs, my personal favorite genre of game, and while they are typically a little more spread out in terms of releases, this year saw a lot of fantastic CRPGs released and yet to release, but we'll get to those in a moment. And these RPGs, with their larger focus on choice and consequence and deeper progression systems, tend to be a lot more involved in terms of minute-to-minute gameplay than other titles. Though one of this game's biggest launches just so happens to be a CRPG that I'm sure you've heard of, which is Baldur's Gate 3, a near universally praised RPG that, while it does have a couple of things I would nitpick as a lover of the genre, for the purposes of this video, it's great, easy to recommend, but otherwise, continuing the much-loved classics, Baldur's Gate 1 and 2, this one sees us taking on the role of one of a few different potential origin characters, or our own custom main character, as we fight off a transformation into a mind flayer, which then unravels into even larger plots. A ton to offer and say on this one, which is why I would point you to check out my almost hour-and-a-half review for it if you want a more in-depth look. Again, very easy to recommend. The base price for this one is actually just $60 as well. Though currently this is only available on PC and PlayStation, they are aiming to release this on Xbox before the year is over, with more news on that coming on December 7th. So if you would like to hold out and buy this on Xbox, that should be available soon. Now, while there are several more CRPGs to go over, none of them are quite as grand in scope as Baldur's Gate 3, as that one was a bit of an anomaly. We then have to talk about Colony Ship. Colony Ship is a, I would say, much more challenging CRPG. It has systems that are designed to challenge the player and make things fair for the enemies you are fighting, and while there is an easier mode for the game, this game is just inherently not going to be for everyone because of that approach to difficulty. But if that's not a detractor for you, Colony Ship offers a great story with choice and consequence aboard a generational ship, which is to say a spaceship headed for a planet that is going to take hundreds of years to get there, with people living and dying purely aboard the ship before arrival. It has a really cool premise, a lot of great content, and worth a look if it seems interesting to you. Though its asking price is $40 at full price, and it is only available on PC. But then we have Dark Envoy, another indie CRPG from developer Event Horizon. This one is actually a sequel of sorts to a previous one of their games called Tower of Time, and while you don't need to have played that one to enjoy this one, it is, I think, worth noting. But Dark Envoy puts us in the role of a pair of sibling scavengers as they get embroiled in a war between elves and humans, alongside a few other different fantasy races, in a world that sort of combines almost industrial age steampunk with high fantasy magic. Though what's more, this game also uses real-time with pause, which these days is relatively uncommon for these games, as many of them tend to prefer the turn-based route, as that is what is sort of in vogue, if you will. And this game sees companions to meet, quests to do, choices to be made, though it is a little reined in scope as it is an indie title. That said, to reflect that, the asking price for this one is $30, which I think is well worth it, though the only available platform is PC. In a similar situation, we also have Space Wreck, another indie CRPG only available on PC, though this one for $17. Space Wreck is a throwback to, I would say, more classic RPGs, and while not very long at all, only a few hours, it is highly replayable as you can customize your character in all sorts of ways and find different solutions to the same problems. So if you're looking for a game that's a little more bite-sized but still has a lot of depth to it, then this one might just be for you. Though that does finally bring us to our miscellaneous section. These are games that didn't quite fit in anywhere else but are still worth noting in their own right. And to kick that off, we have Sea of Stars, one of the more well-received indie games this year that is, I would say, a JRPG that takes inspiration from a lot of different titles and packages them together in a relatively interesting way. In it, we take on the role of Solstice Warriors, people who are able to take moon and sun magic to fight off evil beings known as Dwellers, set against some pretty beautifully done pixel art, which I am personally always a fan of. I haven't quite finished this one yet personally, but I have played it and have been enjoying it. So the $35 asking price doesn't put me off too much, and given that it's available on basically everything, it's a relatively easy game to enjoy. Next up, we have Shadow Gambit, which is a, I would say, stealth strategy title where we sneak into various missions, take enemies out stealthily with our team of ghost pirates as we try to find the treasure of the Red Marley. Shadow Gambit is actually going to wind up being the last game out of developer Mimimi Games before they shut down, though they are shutting down by choice, and going out on a bit of a high note, as Shadow Gambit is a genuinely really fun game that lets you quick save and tackle different scenarios involving dismantling defenses and taking out enemies stealthily in really fun ways. It's a very accessible game thanks to all those features, and it's a ton of fun as well. So for its asking price of $40, I think you are getting a pretty good game out of it, though it is only available on current generation consoles and PC. But then we have Octopath Traveller 2, a really great JRPG from the beginning of this year, a sequel of course to Octopath Traveller, and we're going to take, in this particular game, 8 brand new travelers, which is to say party members, across journeys that span their individual stories that then culminate into a broader narrative, a lot of which is really well done and interesting. They do a fantastic job of really bringing the HD 2D graphics at play here to new heights, and if you like older school JRPGs at all, you'll probably enjoy this one a great deal, as it is a ton of fun, which makes its full asking price of $60 a little easier to swallow. And what's more, this particular game is available on basically everything, platform-wise, Nintendo Switch included. Now, while we have already covered a ton of games, we are not quite done yet, because now I'm going to mention a few games that have not yet released, and then we're going to end the video with a section on games that I have not played personally, but are still noteworthy. Now, for our upcoming games, we have 3 that have yet to release before the end of this year, 2 of which are releasing on December 5th, the Thaumaturge and Blood West. Blood West is a pixel-based sort of immersive sim that sees us playing as a revenant in the Old West, as we have been summoned forth to deal with all sorts of problems and corruption, and we do just that. Overall, it's a really fun game, a lot of ways to approach it, different builds to try out, and the full release on December 5th is meant to overhaul a few systems, so it'll be interesting to see how that one plays out. The Thaumaturge, again releasing the same day, puts us in the role of a thaumaturge, or an occultist of sorts, in the early 1900s version of Warsaw. We're going to be tracking down evil entities that have attached themselves to people and started causing all sorts of problems, and collecting these spirits, almost sort of Pokemon style, is going to have effects on our character, who has to make all sorts of moral decisions, which can then lead to different outcomes, and it's certainly a peculiar title. Hard to say much about a recommendation one way or the other because it has not yet released, but it certainly looks interesting and is worth keeping an eye on. Now, last for our upcoming games is on December 7th, we have Warhammer 40k Rogue Trader, the first big CRPG set in the Warhammer universe. This particular game puts us more specifically in the shoes of a rogue trader, a person with an immense amount of wealth and freedom to do as they please in order to further the aims of the Imperium of Man out in space, which is also based on an old tabletop role-playing system at the same time, so this one has a lot going on. I've made many videos covering it if you want more information, so it's definitely one to keep an eye on in December. Now, last but not least for this particular video, I want to end by talking about some games that I have not played personally, but were still very noteworthy this year, so definitely worth keeping an eye on in terms of sales and things like that. First up, we have Tears of the Kingdom, which is available on Nintendo Switch. It is the follow-up to Zelda's Breath of the Wild, and was incredibly well received. It expanded tons of systems in the original, and it was definitely one of the more critically acclaimed games this year, and it is up for Game of the Year, for instance. But then we have Spider-Man 2, available as a PlayStation 5 exclusive, I believe. This one is, of course, the follow-up to another critically acclaimed game, Spider-Man, and while this one had, I would say, a few more technical problems, it was still overall very much so enjoyed. If you have people who love superheroes, Spider-Man in particular, this one's a pretty obvious win if you own a PlayStation. Then we have Super Mario Bros. Wonder, available on the Nintendo Switch. This is probably the one I know personally the least about, but I have seen a lot of very good chatter about it. This one is also up for Game of the Year, and with it being Super Mario's, it's of course pretty much safe for all age groups. But then we have Alan Wake 2. This one I have not played because it was an Epic Games Store exclusive on PC, as this is a PC channel, but I don't usually use Epic Games Store and I just haven't had time to play it. But Alan Wake 2 is more of a horror game that follows up on the original Alan Wake, of course, which is set in Remedy's universe that they've been building around strange paranormal phenomenon, and I've heard this one is quite good. Then we have an interesting case with the Super Mario RPG, which was available on the Switch, and this is a remake, actually, of an RPG that was released, I believe, back in the 90s, that was, again, I would say very well received when it initially launched. So when it was announced they were remaking it, a lot of people were very interested in it, as unlike more traditional side-scrolling Mario games, this one was a full-blown, like, sort of JRPG, turn-based style affair that people really loved. Realistically, I might actually get around to playing this one at some point because I'm very curious about it. But then we have Dave the Diver, a very well received title from earlier this year that sees you exploring the deep sea for all sorts of ingredients to serve up in your restaurant, which you also have to manage, alongside of all sorts of interesting quests, etc. that you get up to in the deep sea exploration side of things, and for $20 this one was quite the hit earlier this year. Probably one of the highest rated games this year if I had to guess. Though in a somewhat similar theme, we actually have Dredge next. Dredge is a game about fishing various coastal waters against a somewhat sinister backdrop with almost Cthulhu mythos-esque tones surrounding the main plot, which adds a strangely sinister tone to the otherwise relatively normal fishing game. Though that is pretty much going to do it for this video. There has been a look at tons of RPGs that have released this year, and as you've hopefully seen, it really has been just a tremendous year for video games, as this is just the RPGs. This doesn't even include all of the other types of genres that have seen some pretty monumental releases this year. So I hope in the course of this video you learned about something that was new that you might be interested in, or perhaps you simply forgot about because it released earlier this year. But down below, I would love to know which of these games you are most excited about, which ones you enjoyed the most. Perhaps you want to talk about some things I didn't mention, as believe it or not, this is far from comprehensive, so do let everyone know about any other interesting games out there that you've played. But that is pretty much going to do it for this video. So I certainly hope you enjoyed it. If you did, like, comment, subscribe, all the YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.